Welcome to the Absolute Beginner's Garden 101, Part 2 of the best way to start planting, presented by the Jefferson Public Library's Seed Library. So where do you start when you're wanting to plan out your garden? The first thing I recommend is, if you have not already, please watch Part 1 of the Absolute Beginner's Garden. It's got so much information on what you need to do to get your garden ready for planting so that you can give those plants the best chance that they have. In Part 2, we're going to talk about how do you plan out your garden and why that's important. It's going to save you a lot of money. We're going to talk about when do you plant your plants. That's important. How do you create shade in a full sun plant? Some plants like a little more shade, and so we're going to specifically talk about one method that you can do that is to no additional cost to you on how to create shade for those plants that like a little more shade. And then we're going to talk about, do you start with seeds or do you start with seedlings for transplants? And do you need to soak those seeds or stretch those seeds? All these things we're going to talk about in Part 2. So for Jefferson, Georgia, we have two basic types of crops. You have your cool season crops, which are planted in early spring, late fall, and yes, you're saying that right, winter. Then you have your warm season crops, which are planted in late spring, early summer, and early fall. As we talked about in Part 1, the garden location is very important. Your location is going to determine what you can plant. So if you have a full sun garden, you may not be able to do some of the shade plants unless you create some shade like what we're talking about. If you have a shade garden, you're not going to be able to plant a lot of the full sun plants. We also talked a lot about the size of your garden in Part 1. The size of your garden is going to determine what types of varieties of these plants you can plant and how much of each plant you can plant. And we'll talk more about that when we get into the planning portion of this episode. So the first thing you're going to need to do when you are planning out your garden is you need a planting chart at your fingertips. Planting chart for your area is crucial. If you're in Washington, you're not going to want a planting chart for Georgia and vice versa. The growing seasons are different. So a planting chart for your area is going to give you the range of time, that window of opportunity of when you can plant your plants to give them the best chance. Also going to tell you if you're going to be direct sowing, which is planting your seeds directly into the ground, or if you're going to be transplanting those seeds, or those plants, instead of direct sowing. Also going to give you the spring planting times and the fall planting times. And some plants, like watermelon, don't have a fall planting time because there's not enough growing time in the season, not enough days for that plant to fully mature, to develop fruit, and for that fruit to ripen before that frost comes in and kills it. So to get a planting chart for Georgia couldn't be simpler. Log on to the website listed below, click on Seed Library, scroll down to Garden Helps, and there you will find a planting chart for the state of Georgia. So the second thing you're going to do is make a wish list. This is everything you might want to be able to grow. And then as you plug it into your planting guide, you'll be able to see, do you have the room for these plants? Or do you need to come up with a different plan, like add a trellis or grow it in a pot? Or you'll be able to figure these things out. Or you might have to make some tough decisions and like, I just can't do that one this year. I have most of these plants are from our easy list that we talked about in Part 1. They're easy to do, great for beginners. I did throw some medium level plants on here, as listed in the Jefferson seed catalog. And you can consider these like intermediate level. They have some challenges. Unlike the easy ones, they have more pest problems. They have fungal problems, disease problems, blossom end rot problems. And so there's just more stuff you got to do to help them along. And if you want more information about how to, specifically the tomatoes and the zucchini, you can go to our website, click on Seed Library, and then go to my blog. It's called Grow Something. And I have blog articles on how to take care of your tomatoes in Georgia and what I do to combat pests with my zucchini. A lot of other helpful information on there as well. But back to our list. We have our warm season crops, which are listed in the color red, and then we have our cool season crops, which are in purple. Our warm season crops are full sun, at least the ones listed here, and our cool season crops is a combination of like some shade and full sun. And as we talked about in part 1, you need to know your lighting requirements, and this is part of the location of your garden. And if you want more information about that, please watch part 1. So I'm going to show you how to get all of these plants in a very small garden. We're going to use my garden size as an example, and I'm going to show you how you can get everything that's listed here in a very small garden with proper spacing and all of that so your plants can thrive. So this is my garden. I have a combination of 3 different types of garden, and we talked more about those types in part 1. I got raised beds, an in-ground garden, and I do container gardening as well. My tomatoes have their own bed. They are in the ground, so I don't have to figure out a planting chart for them. They're taken care of. They're in the ground. They're done. My herbs are in containers on the patio. Now you can plant your herbs in the ground or in raised beds. I don't because I don't have the space, and I love the convenience of having them just a few steps from the kitchen on the patio. So if I'm cooking supper and I'm like, oh, I need some oregano or some parsley, all I have to do is quickly walk a few steps, harvest a few leaves, get back inside before anything burns, and I have the fresh herbs that I can add to the dinner. So that leaves just figuring out my raised beds and how to get all of that organized and get everything that's on our wish list in the garden. As you can see, my raised beds are rather small. My beds are 8 feet by 4 feet with one 4 by 4 footer in the center. So I have a very small garden. So the first time that you might be putting stuff in, you might just dump everything in there. I recommend having a good eraser. I do mine typically not fancy like this on the computer. I usually have a sheet of paper and I just draw it out. So I have a good eraser because it takes a little while to get it sort of figured out to have everything the way it needs to be with all the lighting and the shade and just all of that. In this particular plan, didn't take into any consideration of the lighting requirements, all the trellises and just all of that. I just sort of dumped everything in here. But all I did was break things up into general planting times of summer plants, which are your warm season crops, and your cool season crops, which are fall and spring. And as you can see, we wanted to plant zucchini and dill, and there's no room in here. So let's break this down and let's get this rearranged, keeping in mind our lighting requirements, keeping in mind if we need shade or if we want to prevent shade from being formed, and then trying some other things like growing vertically to create more space for more plants. So starting over, in that top bed, what I have to keep in mind is how the sun tracks in my yard. The sun tracks from the top to the bottom of the page in my yard. So we're going to start with our spring plants in this first bed. I want to do lettuce and I want to do spinach. I'm going to do it just in half the bed here, just on the, I'm going to use 4 feet. So I'm going to have basically 4 rows widthwise planted I'm going to do lettuce up in the top half of the bed, and I'm going to do spinach in the bottom half. Spinach likes a little more light than lettuce does. I'm not going to have to create shade in the spring because of the way that my yard has. I have more shade in the mornings, and the days are also shorter, so I'm good without creating any shade for my spring plants. And the spinach likes a little more sun, so I'm going to put it down in the bottom here so it gets a little more sun before the lettuce. For my okra and my zucchini, my okra I'm going to do in the other half of the bed. I can fit 2 to 3 rows of okra in the 4x4 half of that 8x4 bed. And I'm going to plant it from top to bottom, so lengthwise. And this way, I won't be having as much shade cast in my other beds here. And by the time it's tall enough and it is casting shade, it's not going to be a problem. The zucchini, I can get 2 plants in the corners. You're going to want to do it in the corners. Doesn't matter which ones. And the zucchini comes in a bush variety and a vining variety. For a raised bed small like this, you want to go more with a bush variety. I have to confess, I have done vining in a 4x4 foot section. It can be done. It's a little more work. What you have to do is sort of pick up that plant and spiral it around to keep it contained in its half of the bed. With the bush plant, it's more compact. It will spread out, but it doesn't do it in the same way as a vining variety. And so a bush variety is going to be better for a small garden like this versus a vining, which is going to spread out a lot more. In our second bed, it's a little more complicated. We're going to start with our warm season crops, and then we're going to go to our fall plantings. So in the summer, I want to do black-eyed peas, I want to do green beans, and I want to do cucumbers and eggplants. So for your black-eyed peas, they only come in semi-bush and vining. So there's not really a true bush variety of black-eyed peas. So the best thing, even with your semi-bush, semi-vining, you're going to want a trellis to help keep those contained and let them sort of grow and do their thing. So what I have to keep in mind with the trellis, do I want it to create shade or do I not? Trellis is a great, relatively inexpensive way to create shade in your garden, depending on how you orient it in relation to the sun. I don't want it to create any shade because in the summer, all of these summer plants are full sun plants. So I want to orient my trellis lengthwise, so as the sun comes from top to bottom, it's not going to create any shade on any of the other plants. And I'm going to keep my black-eyed peas on its half of the bed, and so I'm going to do 1 row of black-eyed peas on 4 feet of that side of the bed, and then in the rest of that half of the bed, I can do bush beans, and then I can get more in that bed. So if you have varieties that are vining, you can grow vertically and create more space for more plants. Even in a small garden, you can get more plants in. Cucumbers are very similar. You can get bush variety cucumbers, or you can get vining cucumbers. We're going to do vining in this particular plan because I want that extra space for the eggplants. So we're going to do it exactly the same as we did with our black-eyed peas. Have our trellis oriented lengthwise so it doesn't create any shade. And I'm going to put eggplants. I'll be able to get 2 eggplants on that half of the bed. And that way they have the room that they need. One thing you can do with cucumbers, if you want more eggplant, you want to get a 5-gallon bucket, and it needs to be 5-gallon buckets. Cucumber root systems are pretty big. They need that space in that 5-gallon bucket. You can have 1 plant in a 5-gallon bucket. You can either do a bush variety, or you can make a little trellis for a vining cucumber, and you can have it in a pot. And that way you can have more eggplants or more of something else. In the fall, in this bed, I'm going to do okra, lettuce, spinach, and radish. We're going to use that okra to create shade. So you could go with making shade with a trellis, or you could go making shade by purchasing a shade cloth, but we're going to use okra, so it's of no additional cost to you. And we're going to create shade for that lettuce because that lettuce likes a little more shade. Now, unfortunately, you are going to have to get rid of some of your black-eyed peas to plant your okra, but that's okay because they're probably getting to be about done anyway. So your okra, I'm going to plant it widthwise, so as the sun comes from top to bottom, it will create shade for the plants planted behind it. I'm going to do 2 rows of fall okra. Fall okra is planted in my area around in June. So by the time it gets tall enough and starts creating shade, that's when you plant lettuce, which is typically in September. So we'll be planting lettuce in this portion of the bed, and by this time all the black-eyed peas are gone. You have removed that, you've removed your trellis. And then we'll be able to plant spinach in the middle portion, probably get about 2 rows of spinach. And again, by this time, the cucumber is gone. You're probably sick of your eggplant, but even if it's still going, if you have 2 plants, you can still do some spinach and you can still get your radish in as well. In that center bed, we're going to do spring turnips. And these turnips will most likely be done and harvested by the time it's the time to plant the peppers. I can get 4 to 6 peppers in a 4x4 bed. And since we wanted dill, you can do a border of dill around this bed here. You may want to do just 1 or 2 sides, maybe 3. It's just going to make it a little easier for you to be able to get into those peppers to harvest them. And then our last bed, I wanted to do watermelon. Now, watermelon is really tricky in a raised bed garden because watermelon likes to spread out. So when you're looking at watermelon, if you have a small raised bed, you want to look for a variety that has a smaller coverage, a smaller spread, like a sugar baby. A sugar baby you could probably get away with growing in a 4x8 foot bed because its spread is 6 to 8 feet. Now you still may have to spiral the sucker around. You probably are going to plant it right in the center. And then you might have to spiral the plant as it binds around. And you might still have to prune it to keep it contained. But that variety you can probably get away with planting in a raised bed. If you want to go with a variety that might spread out to 10 or more feet, you're going to want to look, you're probably just going to be better off laying some landscape fabric down or some cardboard in your yard and planting that watermelon there so it can spread out and do its thing. So the last thing we're going to talk about is seeds or seedlings. You're probably going to use both. Some seeds you're going to want to direct sow. Things like your root crops. If you plant those and then want to transplant it, root crops really hate their roots being disturbed and you might damage or even kill the plant. Beans are another one. You're just going to want to direct sow those. They hate having the roots disturbed. Some plants don't mind being transplanted. Things like tomatoes, peppers, you can transplant those. So the advantages of buying seedlings, the hard work is already done for you. Some plants can be really hard to germinate and then grow into little seedlings. So if you're buying the seedlings, all that work is done for you. It's great for beginners. The only thing you need to know is when do you plant those, and your planting chart will tell you. The disadvantages, it's a lot more expensive. there's also less varieties to choose from. You're limited to just what that store has. And then sometimes there's not a lot of instruction on the labels of how do you plant this, when do you plant this, how do you take care of it. But all of that information, if it's in our catalog, is on our website. So the advantages of starting with seeds is it's a lot less expensive. You get a lot more seeds that, depending on the type of seed, might last you a few years. You also have more varieties to choose from. I'm going to be trying a variety of okra that's red and is great for pickling. So things like that, you're not going to typically be able to find those kinds of things in a seedling. You're only going to be able to get it from seeds. But there are some things you need to know when you're starting from seed. Timing is crucial. You're going to want to make sure you check out your planting chart. It will tell you when to plant. You also may need to soak some seeds to help speed up that germination. Some seeds you're not going to want to do. Beans is a great example. Don't soak your bean seeds before you plant them. But okra, you can soak. Depending on the time of year that I am planting okra, I may or may not soak my okra seeds. When I'm planting in the spring, I plant my okra early. And okra doesn't really like the cold. It's a warm season crop. So because I plant it early, it's only going to grow to a foot tall, and then it's going to stay that height until it gets hot, and then it's going to take off. So for spring planting, I don't soak my seeds because I don't care about speeding up that germination process. It's not going to get me anything more. When I plant in the fall, it's already hot. I have a much limited number of days for that okra to grow, mature, and put on its fruit. And so I want to speed up that germination process. So I will soak those seeds overnight before I plant them. And that's just going to give them a little bit of a head start. And then I should hopefully get okra even sooner. So that's sort of the process with the soaking seeds. It depends on the plant. And it depends on if you want to help those seedlings get a head start. Now, stressing seeds is a little different. A great example of seeds that you would need to stress are seeds like catnip. Some seeds like catnip have a very hard outer coating that needs to be broken up so that seedling can punch through and germinate. In nature, seeds like catnip, once they are mature, they'll fall to the ground, and then they'll stay on the ground through the winter. And as with any winter, you got freezes and thaws and freezes and thaws, and that freezing and thawing process helps break up that hard outer covering so that when it gets warm, that seedling can punch through and germinate and get off to a good start. So when you buy seeds like that, like catnip, you're going to need to duplicate that process. And in our catalog, or rather in our growing tips on the website, we have all that information. So if a seed has that, we tell you what to do. So for catnip, you pop the seeds in the freezer overnight, then you soak the seeds, and then you plant the seeds to help break up that hard outer covering so that the seedlings can germinate. Now you can not do that and just plant your catnip seeds, but you're probably going to have a lower germination rate because of that hard outer coating. But our growing tips are going to tell you what to do. If it's in our catalog, we have that information for you. Now, if you want to start seeds for transplants, there's even more information you need to know. It's a little bit more work. It's a little more upfront cost, but once you have your setup, it's going to greatly reduce your cost for your gardening. But you need to know what you're doing. And we have all the information of everything you need to know to get your setup going. By going to our website, click on Seed Library, go to Garden Helps and then look for Starting Seeds Indoors. It's got information on your timing, so you know where to go to find out when you need to start seeds. Some seeds like rosemary, it's a very slow grower. When I start rosemary from seed, I start it in December, and you're not transplanting it until April or May. So it's a very slow grower. Other plants like peppers, you start from seed end of February, beginning of May for Jefferson, Georgia. And then you're transplanting them in April or May. And so you kind of need to know when you need to start from seed for transplanting later. You're also going to need to know your lighting requirements, the supplies that you need, the seed starting mix, why you need seed starting mix versus potting soil, space, planning, all that information, it's on the website. So if you want to start from seed for later transplant, all the information is there on the website. So recap, finally there are two basic crops for Jefferson, Georgia. You got your cool crops and your warm crops. You need to know when to plant them, so get a planting chart for your area. Then make that wish list and plan out your garden. The last thing you want to do is buy all these plants and then go to plant them and find out you don't have space for them. So please plan your garden. It's going to save you money in the long run. And then make sure you know if you're going to need to create shade in your garden or you don't need to create shade in your garden. And then know if you're going to start from seed or with seedlings. And again, if you need to stress or soak your seeds, that information is on our growing tips page. So all the information you need, please go to jefferson.prlib.org, click on Seed Library. And if you want practical tips and even more information, more details on what I do in planting a garden, because we just did a brief overview. It probably sounded like a lot, but it was just really an overview of how to plan your garden. If you want greater detail on what I specifically do when I plan out my garden, check out my blog, Grow Something, that's on the Jefferson Public Library website. And I give you so much more information if you want that information. I do want to thank our sponsors. The Jefferson Seed Library is made possible by donations from Howington's Feed and Supply, Burpee, and of course community members like you who have patiently saved their seeds and then donated it to the Seed Library. So thank you. Please stay tuned for more of the Absolute Beginner Garden, as we will be talking about all different kinds of things to help you have the best garden possible. Have a great day.